All right, welcome folks to our final talk. It's a pleasure to introduce Wang, who will tell us about charting LLM embedding spaces with explainable mapper. Explainable AI meets topology.
Thank you for being here for the last talk. And I would like to thank Yasu for the nice invitation. This is a very productive workshop and also very fun. Okay, so this is, majority of my talk is going to be a piece of new work I did. But before I do that, I'm going to give a little bit more background of how to use Mapper as a topological tool to understand latent space of large language model or in general deep learning models. And then the new piece of work I'm going to present is a collaboration with my PhD student, Xinyuan Yan, who likes to work on explainable AI with data visualization, and collaborator Rita, Sini, and Mena from ETH. Okay. Okay, now it's worked. Before I do that, so today's talk is very applied. There's not too much of a deep math in there. But I also want to do a small advertisement for the talk next week, where I'm going to talk about tracking the persistence of harmonic chains. This is a collaboration work with Tao, Simon, at Sausage next week on Tuesday. So in this case, we're introducing a new type of barcode that is called harmonic chain barcode, which tracks the evolution of harmonic chains. So we also shows that this harmonic chain barcode is stable. And then we also, to define what is a harmonic chain group is the group of p cycle that is also p cocycle. So in this case, I want to just give a teaser image. If you have this filtration, on the left is the harmonic chain barcode, and on the right is ordinary persistence barcode. Just to give you a taste of the fact that they're different. And also, we have the algorithm that if you have a filtration of simplicial complex of size m, you can actually compute the harmonic chain barcode in O of m to the power of 3. And this is sort of the illustration of computing the harmonic chain barcode together with the representatives. So if you want to hear this talk, please come to Sausage next week. All right. So today I'm going to have a separate thing. I forgot to use the microphone, but I think I'm pretty loud. So today my main question is, what is the shape of the high dimensional latent space of deep learning model? And when I say shape, of course, I would like to use tools coming from geometry and topology to understand how the latent space of those deep learning models are organized. The main piece of my talk is going to be based on the first paper. I promise to post it on arXiv this week, at some point this week. And then there's a series of other works that we did in this space that you're going to see a few pictures at the first part of my talk. Okay, so a bit of a topology background. So the idea is, if you give me a high dimensional point cloud, I would like to see what is sort of the shape of this high dimensional point cloud. So the natural tool we're going to use is called the mapper graph. So in the case of mapper graph, let's say on the left-hand side, this is a point cloud, two-dimensional point cloud sample from two circles. But you can imagine in our setting, each of those points will be a high dimensional point from the latent space of a deep learning model, which I will make it precise soon. So this point could be what we call activation vector of image classifier or word embedding from large language model. And the right-hand side is example of the mapper graph under appropriate choice of parameters. And it's a good summary of the left in the sense that the left space has, two circles, and then the mapper graph somehow preserve those two circles. So basically you can think about the mapper graph as a form of discrete approximation of this topological object called RIP graph. Earlier this week, there was actually a talk that mentioned RIP graph. RIP graph is sort of the, think about it as sort of continuous skeleton of some manifold together with a function. And then the mapper graph is a tool that you can actually think about if I have point sample from the underlying space, what is sort of a skeleton representation of the point cloud sample. So the idea is that the mapper graph is a graph. And this work is done by Fagundu, Carson, and Singh back in 2007. And then the high-level picture behind the mapper graph is basically takes a high-dimensional point cloud into a graphical representation that captures the cluster and cluster relations. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, I'm going to show you sort of like an animation of how to create a mapper graph from a point cloud sample. So in this case, when I say it's captured cluster and cluster relations, is that in the mapper graph on the right, what's my pointer? Here, maybe? Okay, never mind. Every single node here is a cluster, and every single edge is captured the relation between the clusters. All right, so let's start with the point cloud on the left. I will start with a filter function. In this case, the filter function can be the height of each point or just the y coordinate. And I'm looking at the range of my function. I'm going to start with a cover. So those are 5 cover elements. And then in this case, and in most cases, we work with uniform cover. That means the cover elements in the one-dimensional line intervals of the same length. And then there's a certain amount of overlap. Oh, thank you. Okay. So in this case, I have 5 intervals, and then the overlap is around 25% overlap. And then for giving a cover element, V1, for example, I can look at the part of the data who falls in this interval. So in this case, I'm looking at all the points whose function value is falls into this interval, and I'm going to apply my favorite clustering algorithm. And typically, people use dbScan, which is a density-based clustering algorithm. And if I have sufficiently dense sample, then all the points that is falls in this interval is now having one cluster. And then I move on to the next cover element. Again, I look at all the data points whose function value falls into this range, apply dbScan, and then dbScan will produce sort of 3 clusters that is enclosed by those 3 rectangles. And that gives rise to 3 points in my mapper graph, so 3 nodes in my mapper graph. And I keep going for each. Oh, and also in this case, if you look at cluster, if I look at cover element, that is the red, the green, and then the purple. Again, I do the same thing. I recover clusters of my data points. And the next step is that when the 2 clusters have non-empty intersection, I put an edge between them. For example, in this case, cluster on the left is enclosed by the rectangle U1 and another rectangle U2. They have non-empty intersection. Now I have a pointer right here. There's non-empty intersection. Then there's an edge between them. And I continue this process where I put edge between clusters that has non-empty intersection that produces the mapper graph on the right. And again, under good assumption on the sample and appropriate choice of parameters, we can recover a mapper graph that captures the shape of the point cloud on the left. There's a lot of active research in the theoretical understanding of mapper graph, which roughly boil down to, number 1, what is a convergence behavior, which is if you sample enough sample from the underlying space, as the number of sample goes to infinity, is there some sort of a convergence between the shape of mapper graph with the shape of RIB graph? Number 2 is stability, and so on. And number 3 is a parameter tuning. What is the best strategy to do parameter tuning for a mapper graph? But today, I'm going to primarily use mapper graph as a tool to study high-dimensional point cloud coming from deep learning models. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first part of my talk, I'm going to give you a few backgrounds of some of the previous work we did in this space to motivate explainable mapper. So to start, first thing we're going to look at is image classifier. So specifically convolutional neural network. So convolutional neural networks, or sometimes called CNNs, they are tools for image classification. And if you provide sort of like an image input, there's a specific patch of this image that goes through the whole network. And what we care about is at a specific, the output of a convolutional layer. So in this case, I will go into this a little bit more. The idea is for a specific, if giving a pre-trained image classifier, I'm going to probe it with an image, and I'm going to take a patch of the image and look at what we call activation vector. So activation vector can be understood as collecting the output of a neuron at a fixed layer. And then if I probe the neural network with, say, I don't know, 1,000,000 images, then I get 1,000,000 points that is forming my point cloud, which I'm going to apply the mapper. And then the question is basically, can we study the topology of those activation vectors? So let's go into activation vector a little bit more. So in this case, there's actually an image of some animal. I'm going to focus on one specific patch at the lower left corner of this image. So there's a patch right here. And at a specific convolutional layer, I'm going to look at, let's say hypothetically, this layer only have 5 neurons. So for every single neuron, when it takes the input of this patch, it's going to produce an output. So in this case, with 5 neurons, I'm going to collect a point that is 5-dimensional, where each dimension is a neuron output. And this, if I do this way, this is actually called spatial activation. There's other ways to collect activation vector, which is what we call channel activation. Channel activation is you focus on a single neuron and you look at all the outputs of this neuron reacting to a particular different patches of the same image. So another way to think about this is that this entire cube are basic informations that collect all the neurons output with respect to different patches of this. And taking different slices will give me different type of high dimensional point cloud. The one we're going to focus very much on is sort of the spatial activation, which is basically the output of all neurons for a specific image patch. So if we do this, this is sort of the mapper graph picture of an image classifier called ResNet18. It has 16 convolutional layer. The input image data set we use is called CIFAR10. It contains 50,000 images across 10 different classes. Those image classes are things like airplane, automobile, horse and deer, and so on and so forth. And then in order to construct a mapper graph, we need to choose a filter function. In this case, the filter function of choice is L2 norm of each of those activation vector. And then the point cloud that we behind this mapper graph is of dimension 512 because we focus on the convolutional layer 16 of the ResNet18 model. And at that layer, there are 512 neuron. So for each input image, we take a patch of it. We collect the neuron output at that layer. So every single image patch produce a 512 dimensional point. And then using L2 norm as a filter function, I construct a mapper graph. And the mapper graph is shown on the left. This is an image classifier that has a very high classification accuracy. So the node of each of this mapper is actually colored by the ground truth label of the underlying images. So if you look at this specific branch here, they're all purple. They all correspond to deer. That means that the image activation are all coming from deer images. Of course, when you apply the mapper is oblivious of the underlying ground label, right? So this is really just a reflection of how well the model did in terms of separating different classes. Because the classifier is close to 98% accuracy, it's actually separated the image quite well. And in this specific case, it's indicated as different branches. Each branch of this mapper graph corresponding to roughly a specific class. And of course, you see this kind of this tail end of this mapper graph where you see the color is like a pie chart. Those are, you can think about those are topological neighborhoods where there's many mixture of images. And in fact, from here, this is all the images with the lowest L2 norm. The reason why we use L2 norm is a way of indicating how strongly the network is reacting to this input. And if you actually dive into some of those images with low L2 norm, those are actually images of pretty low quality. Right? And of course, if you follow this, you have increasing L2 norm. And then you go to each of those branch. Along this branch, the L2 norm increases. And then, this is the one with the highest L2 norm locally in this branch. So there's many interesting structures that you can study from mapper graph of image activations. For example, many of you probably heard me talking about this forever because I like branches, but I also like sub branches, right? So each of those branch roughly corresponding to the 10 different classes, but you also see sub branches. For example, here is a sub branch of deer, sub branch of horse. They basically bifurcate a little bit later, right? And then if you look at images in here, a lot of images in here sort of have horse and deer images mixed. And a lot of the deer images here, you don't see the antler very well. And the second, the second branch I also like to see is this further sub branch. This is one is automobile, which is this one, and this is truck, right? So again, among all the 10 classes, there is sort of a hierarchy among those classes, and it's also reflected through the mapper graph. Okay, so if I push this a little bit further, right, you want to say, okay, here is my sort of mapper graph of image activations. What if my model is under adversary attack? So the famous example of image classifier under adversary attack is that when you have a stop sign and the self-driving car will see it at a stop sign, but if you put some weird patch on the stop sign, like even if it's a little patch, it will fail to recognize it's a stop sign, right? So when I say adversary attack, it's introducing some perturbation to the images so that the model loses its classification or accuracy. So one example, I'm not going to detail, is called L infinity PGD attack. But in this work, what we're interested is that in this case, of course, I'm using a toy data set. This is MNIST, which is handwritten digits. It's from 0 to 9. So again, this is a mapper structure. For the clean model, again, you roughly see branches of digits that show up. For this image classifier, it's classifying the handwritten digits. But when you start thinking about doing adversary attack to this model, you basically introduce perturbation to the handwritten digits. And then you can look at the model, how the model behave, right? So again, for a clean model under adversary attack, it's going to start losing its classification accuracy, and this is going to be reflected on the right. So this is sort of the mapper graph under the attack. So you can start seeing that some of those, and in this case, I have to tell you, I'm actually now color them by the accuracy. So the one that is red is good. The one that is light color, are the ones where the model is not behaving so well. And then you can look at some neighborhood here. For example, there's one neighborhood that is kind of have a lower accuracy. It's a mixture of the ground truth label is number 3 digits, number 7 digits mixed together. But the model is trying to predict it's number 3, number 7, and number 9, and so on. So you basically can use, again, mapper graph to study how high dimensional point clouds behave under adversary attack and use it as a way to assess the robustness of the model itself. So the next thing I want to move on is going from image classifier, which is what we call activation vectors, to activation vectors of sentences and tokens in sentences. So that is things about word embedding. So word embedding is essentially activation vector of large language models. Okay. So the idea is that, this is sort of the standard simplified view of the architecture for BERT, which is one of those more old large language model. Is basically a stack of what's called encoder architecture. The interesting thing you want to just take away from this picture is that BERT has 12 layers. At every single layer, I can collect the activation vector, similar as before for ResNet 18. For every single convolution layer, I can collect activation vectors. In here, for every single layer, between 1 to 12 of the BERT model, I can collect what we call word embedding. So what is word embedding? So those are sentences in a word. Those are called token. So especially in contextualized word embedding, it's going to basically, once it goes through the large language model as a specific layer, you can again collect a high dimensional representation of each of those tokens as a high dimensional vector. And that's what I call word embeddings. And it's contextualized in the sense that, say, today I'm riding my bike. The word my has its own embedding versus I give you my car key and that my has a different embedding. So it's contextualized embedding, meaning that the token embedding is in the context of the sentence. So now we're going to apply mapper to this point cloud. Okay. So the question of study the sort of the shape of word embeddings is that, what is sort of the geometry and topology signature of them, and what is the sort of organizational principle behind those word embeddings. The ingredients we're going to use are, first of all, we're going to obtain the word embedding from the large language model as a high dimensional point cloud. We apply the mapper graph, and then we provide in the previous work exploratory visual analytics tools for people to try to explore this. So let's be a little bit more specific. The BERT model stands for bidirectional encoder representation from transformers. So those are basically people, when it first come out, it's considered as sort of a general purpose large language model. It's pre-trained and people can take it and refine it for their specific task. So one thing why people care about understanding the organizational principle behind word embeddings is that the model itself is very helpful in improving a large number of sort of NLP tasks, NLP natural language processing tasks, but it's not immediately clear why do BERT work so well. So that's because those word embeddings, which in the previously I called them activation vectors, it's a bunch of high dimensional point clouds, right? And the space is not easy to understand. So the first system we build is called TopoAct. ACT stands for activation vectors. And what I'm going to show you is example, a snapshot of the mapper graph built from the BERT model. And the specific set of input I put into my model are, close to 5,000 sentences and around 80,000 tokens. And I'm obtaining, so basically underlying point cloud is around 80,000. So here's a concrete example. For example, the input sentence will be something like, she invited me for tea and massage. So the word me is a token. And once I go through the large language model, the token me is going to have a high dimensional representation. I collect all of them, apply mapper, and try to look at how does mapper look like with respect to my input. So for example, this is zoom in into a small area of the mapper graph of the word embedding at layer 9 of the BERT model, right? So in this case, you can see there's two branches. There's the top branch that has cluster of word embedding A, a cluster B with word embedding, and on the other branch is as a cluster C. If you look at what's in cluster A, it seems like, well, Roman Emperor in 1701, on January 17, 1831, and so on. So it's all about time. Same thing with B, right? It's in the early 2000s, in 2010. So this whole branch is all about time. The other branch is actually in Cleveland, in the so-called Rust Belt in Moscow, is all about position, location. So this is actually a bifurcation in the mapper graph that corresponding to either location or time. But they're all focusing on the contextualized embedding of the word in or on. Okay, so this is basically one example where the mapper is able to sort of reveal the linguistic structure of the large language model. And then the idea is, if we provide the mapper as an exploratory tool, people can use it to do sort of to think about, what is the sort of investigative directions we can understand this model. Why is it so successful with a large number of linguistics tasks? So let's go a little bit deeper in the layer. So if I look at layer 12, so this is later layers of the model. This is, again, a bifurcation that is happening. So if you look at, this branch right here, again, every single cluster, I'm giving examples of embeddings in there. For example, here, I'm with my mother, my dog, me bike, versus here is that it's invited me, looked at me, look at me. So it's basically the differentiation between what they call personal pronoun, which is me, and persistent form, which is my. So, and then the interesting part that I really like is that, the persistent form, me, also shows up here because it's maybe a local dialect where the me is actually used in term of my. So you can actually see this kind of very interesting differentiation that differentiate pronouns. Okay, so why do I give those examples? In the past, we will have to sort of ask the large language model, ask the domain experts, in this case is machine learning experts, NLP experts, to play with it And then they have to interpret what's going on, right? So what is this branch doing? What is this node doing? How are the words organized? So when I say explainable mapper is that, we want to move a little bit further to explainable AI, where we actually ask a large language model to help me summarize what is in this node, what is in this branch, and what separate those two branches and so on, and try to provide automatic explanation of how the words are organized. So that's why I'm giving you all those examples, because currently all the interpretations is coming from our NLP experts, but later on what you're going to see is explanations now coming from a large language model agent. Okay. I want to give a few more examples. So this is sort of like, you can see in this case, there's sort of like a path. I move from A, B, C, D, and so on. In A, it's talk about sea, ocean, marine. In B, it's talk about waves. In C, it's going to talk about water. In D, it's going to move from water to oil, basically. And then in E, is moving to water, rain, and water, right? So it's go from sort of ocean to sort of culinary usage, right? So you can see, even though the word didn't change much, but the actual contextualized meaning is changing along the different part of my word embedding space. Similar to here, as you move from different parts of this, it goes from things like photography to photo to art and so on. So one of the hypotheses is that the BERT, which is as a large language model, is actually capture what people think is a word knowledge and common sense knowledge in its underlying embeddings. Okay, and there's also a differentiation between later layer. This is layer 9 versus early layer. So early layer is I'm going the wrong direction. So earlier layer is actually focused more on local syntax of the word. And another way to say it, they are non-contextual semantics versus later layer, as what you just saw earlier, corresponding to global sentential structure and semantics. So in earlier layer, this is layer 3. It's really just mostly focused on the meaning of the word, but not in the context of the sentence. So you, again, have a branch here where this branch is talk about impossible, hard, and this branch is talk about most, best, better, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so those are basically mostly looking at local syntax of those words and how they bifurcate in terms of different levels or difficulties or good or better and so on. And then there's also the more nuanced things that, again, we have to consult an NLP expert for interpretability. For example, in this case, on the right-hand side, if you look at this note here, it says, well, modify the coordinate system of geometry when recovering the wrapping of the figure. On this side, it says, Galileo's, I can't say, my tongue is twisted. Mathematics after his expulsion from, so it's a difference between sort of when versus after. And in this case, this is actually, when the NLP expert looks at it, it was very surprising for them to see this also show up in the mapper graph, because both sides are used to convey temporal meaning, right? So when the word when is used to introduce discourse relationships like explanations or something related to causality, and then the other one is slightly different, right? So those two basically usages are directly represented in the BERT embedding. And it basically says that, the model, the BERT model as a large language model is able to tell those subtle differences from one another, okay? So the idea is that for those subtle differences, we're also hoping eventually that our agent, large language-based agent, is also going to tell those differences. For us, when my student first look at this, their first reaction is the mapper was producing a structure that is not expandable. But then when we presented to the NLP expert, they was like, yeah, of course, this makes sense. There's a very subtle differences between those two sides of the branches in terms of, the separation between when you use the word after, when you use the word when. Okay, so that is sort of one motivation of why we want to do this automatically, right? We want to have, some tools to help us better explain the local neighborhood of large language model. So before I move into the new work, I have one more piece is that not only we can look at the word embedding, as you see before, those are pre-trained BERT models. Now, what we can also do is look at how does the mapper graph change as I'm doing fine tuning. So the whole idea of fine tuning is the following, is that a lot of large language model is very expensive to train. Sometimes it takes hours, sometimes they take days to train. So, usually, maybe a company will train the large language model and make it public. And then when you actually want to perform specific natural language task, you are going to basically do fine tuning on the model, meaning that you start with a model with existing weights and you do some sort of fine adjustment of the weights of the neurons. So it's improve accuracy for certain tasks. And then usually when you actually fine tune the model, it takes minutes to hours to fine tune the model, and then you can do your inference tasks. So I just want to show one picture of looking at the mapper graph before and after fine tuning. This is sort of the BERT model again. On the left-hand side, you see this is a mapper graph of a specific NLP task. The color is basically, this is an NLP task that is related to classification. So the color you see is sort of the ground truth label. So you can, on the high level, what you see is that at the beginning of the fine tuning, the outer box pre-trained BERT model has a lot of mixed node. So again, mixed node meaning that for this specific task you are interested in, the baseline model does not do very well, right? It's kind of have a mixed, a lot of neighborhood that the model is not able to kind of differentiate or separate. And then right-hand side is exactly how the mapper graph looks like after you fine-tuned it for this specific classification task. You can see that almost all of those mapper pieces are actually very pure. Pure meaning that they have the ground truth label is pretty much associated with each of those neighborhood. Pure meaning that it's only have one color, right? And then there's also a very good separation between different classes. Okay, so you can again looking at the structure of mapper graph before and after fine tuning to see how well the model behaves. We also kind of look at this across different large language models for the same tasks, and you can also look at the mapper graph in terms of the quality of the model itself. Okay, so finally, I think I'm ready to move on to the new piece of work, which we call expandable mapper. So I want to go back to the mapper structure itself. This is like a different sort of mapper point cloud. But the elements I want you to pay attention is that if you give me a mapper, there's different elements in this mapper that I want to explain, right? So first one is basically, the nodes, the path, between two nodes, the edge, and then the trajectory. I'll explain the trajectory very soon. It's something slightly non-intuitive. So let's look at this. This is another example of a mapper in certain area. So basically, think about the node of this mapper graph is represent a collection of word embeddings. They belong to the same topological neighborhood. So we want to know, what is the similarities of all those nodes in there. And then you have an edge. Here's an edge, right, between two adjacent nodes. So think about the edge is going to capture the connectivity between two neighborhoods with non-empty intersections. So think about if I want to explain the edge, I'm thinking about what is the similarity between those neighborhoods. And then there's a path, which is if you pick up a source node and a target node, for example, here is a source node, here is a target node, right? So there's a collection of nodes that is along along a path. There's the shortest path connecting two nodes in the mapper graph. And then also there's components. So components, think about this basically as an island in my mapper graph. And finally, there is a trajectory. So a trajectory, is to say I pick up of a word of an embedding in the source, and I pick up one embedding here, maybe one embedding right here, and I would like to look at a sequence of one token perturbation that will get from my first starting embedding to my end embedding. Okay, and then the visualization is such that I kind of visualize those trajectory by projecting the intermediate embeddings to their nearest nodes in the mapper graph. So what does I mean by one token perturbation? This is exactly one token perturbation. And not surprisingly, this one token perturbation is always also generated by a large language model. Basically, I said, here's my starting sentence, here's my end sentence, here's my token of interest. Can you introduce a small perturbation at every step of the way, only perturb one token so that I can connect the source and the end? So for example, the starting sentence is, we waited until 2 p.m. and then left. The word I'm interested is until, so I want to have the word until fixed. But then the next sentence, you can see that, where's the perturbation? Oh, yeah. 225 to 230, right? There's a small perturbation. There's another time perturbation, another time perturbation, but here, this left, I change it to departed, and so on, right? So this is what I call by one token perturbation. I'll explain things on the left later. But the idea is that if I think about this as some form of random walk, right? I have a starting location, I have an end location, I perturb one token at a time. I want to see how I'm moving through this space. Okay, so on the high level, what do we have? We have, we apply the mapper graph to study sort of word embeddings. And what we mean by explainable mapper is that we introduce what we call two mapper agent. One agent is called explainer, and one agent is called verifier. So those agents will basically perform several tasks. One is summarization, one is comparison, and one is perturbation. And the idea is to generate and verify explanations of those mapper elements. For example, understand the linguistic aspects of the clusters, which are the nodes, the connectivities, which are the edges and paths, as well as transitions, which corresponding to trajectories. Okay. So what are some of the tasks those agents should be involved with? First of all, let's think about what is the user of the system. The users are going to be model developers, people who work with large language models, also people who work with computational linguistics, and maybe people who perform data analysis. And then they all are interested in exploring the space of word embeddings for many different purposes. So for example, they want to assess the model's strengths and weaknesses by looking at the organization of the word embedding. They want to evaluate the information the model captures across different layers. For example, BERT has 12 layers. So you want to see how does the model behave at every single layer. And then for some people, they're what we call model-driven users. So basically, they're developers. They're interested in analyzing and compare those embeddings to understand the insights into how the model is performed and behave. And then there's also people who are interested in what we call data-driven users. So those are more like computational linguistics. So they are interested in examining the embedding space to try to study characteristics of underlying data itself, okay? So both group of users, the major usage is going to think about, they are going to use it to generate and verify hypotheses about their specific interests. So, and then we basically boil down to different number of tasks. So the first type of task, of course, those are all centered around mapper elements. The first type is to think about what is the characteristics associated with the node of the mapper. So a node is basically a collection of word embeddings that falls into the same topological neighborhood. So the idea is, well, it's a cluster of contextualized word embeddings. So the question is, what are the common semantics or syntactic features of those clusters, right? So, and then this is actually very commonly used in the literature where the sort of embeddings are sort of analyzed in relation to their neighborhoods, right? So what is the shared characteristics of those embeddings, okay? And then, of course, when I understand one node, I also want to understand a pair of nodes. So you want to see, if you give me two mapper nodes, how does the large language model differentiate the linguistic property of those two nodes? So that's the first task, is to study the nodes. The second task is now study the edge, right? Remember the edge in a mapper graph corresponding to shared information between two neighborhoods. So essentially, it contains overlapping data from both neighborhoods. So when you study the edge, you want to study the similarities and differences between the neighboring nodes. The interesting thing about studying the edge is that it captures what we will call subtle linguistic variations. For example, we have seen examples where in one node, the token 4 is used at the beginning versus a node next to it, the token 4 is used in the middle of the sentence. So some very subtle differences. And of course, when you go from edge, there's naturally path. Oh, this is actually an example where you can also see it from the path, is you want to extend sort of from the edge to a path, connecting multiple nodes to look at how does the linguistic property actually evolve, right? So for example, this is an example I have where this is a piece of the mapper graph where they are all focused on the embedding S, right? But if you go from left to right, this is at what they call fronted usage because the S is at the beginning of the sentence versus, to the right is what they call non-fronted usage, because you use the word at in the middle of the sentence, right? So this is a very simple example of studying the path in the macro graph to look at the evolution. The next one is, of course, you want to focus on our components, right? So the components, when you see a large language model that is doing really well for a task, is actually separate them into components. So the idea is, what is the sort of high-level information that is captured by different islands or different components in the macro graph. And finally is trajectories, right? So trajectories is one thing that I find it most interesting, and we haven't explored too much of it. But the main idea is that this is sort of the underlying mapper structure, but I pick up a starting sort of embedding, and then there's an embedding, and introduce this one token perturbation. The idea of exploring how this one token perturbation or this perturbation of this trajectory is trying to tell us exactly what is potential ways for me to move from one part of my space to the other, okay? So essentially what we call, this is what we will call semantic pathways, right? So, how does the concept evolve through those intermediate regions? So, okay. So, and then, because this is explainable AI interactive visualization system, we have to talk about some sort of things related to workspace requirement. Specifically, we want to be able to support rapid identification of region of interest. We want to have some interactive elements for selection and inspection. We want to support evaluation of the robustness of explanation. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about robustness. And finally, we will also ask user to be able to put annotations whenever they see interesting. So when we talk about robustness, this is exactly where the perturbation comes in. So I will tell you very soon. So there's motivation of trying to do this automatically is we want to introduce something called mapper agents. Because previously, when we have the mapper structure, we show it to experts and ask them to explain to us why are those words are organized a way that is reflected in the macro graph. And it's very time consuming and mentally demanding. So instead, we want to replace the human experts by agents. And those agents are basically large language model based automatic agents that their tasks are three. One is summarization, one is comparison, and one is perturbation. Okay. So those are called explanation agent or verification agent or explainer and verifier. So number one, what they could do is they won't summarize. Say they basically look at giving me a mapper element. Maybe it's a node, maybe it's an edge. We basically want to ask the agent to give me a summarization of what is the common characteristics of things in that node. Comparison is if you give me two nodes, tell me the differences and similarities. Okay. There's also perturbation. Perturbation is actually what's interesting is that you really want to look at, well, can we examine and confirm the explanation I just got is somewhat stable? So the idea of this is that if I, for example, if I try to explain a node, for the given mapper node, I will have the initial explanation, right? Summarizing what's shared properties in that node. And then what I will do is I will actually introduce a one token perturbation for all the word embeddings in that node, and you summarize it again. And then you look at basically cosine similarities between the explanations, the new explanation, also the old explanation and the perturbed explanation, and you want to have high consistency score, meaning that with small perturbations, this explanation does not change much. Okay, that's what consistent score is. So if consistent score is cosine similarity between the sentence embedding of the original against the perturbed explanation. Okay. So again, this is the example we've seen before. This is one token perturbation of the trajectory. You can also do one token perturbation for all the elements in a node. Okay. And the verifier and so the two agent is formulated in the following way. So with the explainer, we want to diverge the exploration space. So we want to create many possible explanation candidates. And with verifier, we want to converge those explanations to those that is robust and likely to explain the underlying embedding space. So so both of them work together to try to facilitate the generation and verification of hypotheses about the word embedding space. Specifically, we want to use those agents to support user to discover reasons for the resulting mapper structure. For example, the unique properties of embeddings within nodes and the characteristics and of transition between the nodes. So the reason you see this picture is that we're thinking about very much like a decoder and decoder kind of model, where the main purpose of explainer is that it's generate many hypotheses, and then the verifier is the one that try to confirm some of those hypotheses, so have a eventual divergence or convergence. So let's give examples. So because I have many different type of mapper elements, so we have things like, node explainer, and node explainer can do two things. Number one, on the left is that it will summarize a node. So you input a bunch of nodes, a node in the mapper graph and collection of data points. The data points are the word embeddings in that node. And then it's going to output a common properties of the input data points. And then it also does comparative analysis. So if you give me two nodes of the mapper graph and the corresponding their word embeddings, it's going to try to tell me the similarities and differences between those two. So to give example, here are the prompt that you ask the agents. This is basically the prompt associated with the node explainer, right? So the instruction is like, you are a linguist analyzing word usage. You give your sentences, each containing focus words. Your task is to analyze those sentences, determine how those focus words are commonly used, right? So this is a prompt we use as explainer. So it will give us a summary of the nodes, okay? I'm not going to go into detail, but you can trust me to say this works. It gives us pretty good explanations. Okay, and then similarly, we have edge explainer, we have path explainer, right? The path explainer, if I want to summarize, I want to provide a bunch of nodes along a shortest path in the mapper graph together with the data points, and you provide the summary of in this case, the summary is a progression property over the path, right? As I move along this path in my mapper graph, how does the linguistic property change along the way? And you can also do comparisons. We have component analysis. And finally, it's a trajectory explainer. This is one that introduce, make a lot of use of perturbation. Basically, you provide a starting embedding, ending embedding, and then you basically generate a trajectory that connects to the two data points and intermediate sentences attached to them, and then provide a summarization. Okay. And the verification agent, right? Remember, the explanation agent is going to give you a lot of sort of explanations. The verification agent is going to use a perturbation to try to verify the output of explainer. Specifically, I'm just going to use the example of a node explainer, right? So is an interplay between node explainer and node verifier. So the input to the verifier is going to be the initial summary, right, coming from explainer, together with the data points that has been perturbed. So the verifier is going to look at the perturbed embeddings and the summary and assess its similarity to the initial ones, okay? So in a way that the verifier is to say, okay, how much do I trust your explanation? Is that if I perturb the data that original explanation come from a little bit, and it generate a new explanation, the new explanation should be too far from original explanation, right? So this gives me a sense of the stability of the explanation. Okay, so this is sort of the workspace. I'm actually just going to I'm going to go back to, actually, I want to explain a little bit over the data. The data you're going to see are BERT model, and the specific task is called SuperSense row. And it contains 41 labels, and it has around 4,000 tokens. SuperSense row is focusing on propositions. We fine-tune the model for a number of epochs, obtaining the high dimensional point cloud, which is 768 dimensional point cloud, and we are at every single layer of the model. And we apply the mapper to those. And then the agent, the explainer, and the verifier are both built on top of GPT-4.0 as the underlying language model. So the top here is showing the color of the 41 labels. So I'm, without knowing exactly what this NLP task is, just think about it as a classification task. that, look at, 41 different, labels of the proposition. If you want to know a little bit more, the proposition on top, right, is a supersense row, is really a way to predicting semantic category of proposition called supersense. Right? So just think about it as a classification task where there's 41 labels for classifying propositions. So let me go to the actual video. So
in this video, we first present an overview of the explainable mapper workspace, followed by demonstrations of two use cases. This interface visualizes word embedding data from the final layer of the BERT model, fine-tuned on the supersense role classification task. The center is the mapper graph of word embeddings. It supports basic interactions like zooming, panning, and dragging. This view shows the 2D projection of the word embeddings. Users can switch different projection methods and select regions of interest by using tools like lasso or brush. Once a region is selected, the corresponding regions in the mapper graph are highlighted. At the bottom is the settings panel, which colors views by supersense labels or by L2 norm. Mapper node size can reflect the number of instances or be set equally. Similarly, edge width can encode overlapping instances or be set equally. Users can overlay keywords onto mapper components, which are pre-computed by GPT. These keywords are positioned to avoid overlap, and additional keywords appear upon zooming in. Keyword overlays can also be applied at the node level. The mapper graph layout can be set to a force-directed layout or aligned with the projection view. Users can use explanation and perturbation agents by selecting different graph elements. Selecting a node reveals a bar chart showing the distribution of tokens or labels within the node, along with LLM-generated explanations, consistency scores, and perturbed explanations. Users can refine these explanations. A detailed list of instances appears in the table below. A comparison button allows users to select a second node to generate comparison explanation and show detailed information. Under the edge selection mode, users can select an edge to inspect and explain the relationship between connected nodes. Users can also select the shortest path between two nodes to generate a path evolution explanation. Clicking on individual nodes along the path reveals example instance. Under the component selection mode, users can select a component to inspect its explanation and inspect individual examples. Besides, in the control view, users can adjust mapper graph parameters to generate a new graph, or switch to the ball mapper setting to create a ball mapper. Now we show the first use case, temporal prepositions. In the final layer of the fine-tuned BERT model, we observe that temporal prepositions are contextualized such that words indicating end time, like until, and start time, like from, are largely separated into two distinct components. We then compare the two components and generate a comparison explanation with a high consistency score. It says one component primarily uses since and from to denote starting points, while the other uses until and to emphasize endpoints. Additionally, we observe a single node labeled as end time that is separated from the main end time component. To investigate this separation, we select one node from each component and choose a representative sentence from each to construct a perturbation trajectory connecting them. These sentences are projected onto the mapper graph, revealing that the transition between the two components occurs between "I waited until 5 p.m. and then departed," and "I thought I would have to wait until 5 p.m. By comparing other sentences, this may indicate that word position influences this separation. We show the second use case, since in temporal and causal contexts. The word since can convey temporal information or causality. In the early layer, by searching for the word, instances of since with different labels are mixed within a single component. By the final layer, they split into 3 components, each matching a specific label. In the middle layer, they form a continuous path, with labels gradually transitioning from one type to another. To explore the evolution, we apply Path Explainer to this path. The explanation consistently suggests that the usage of since evolves from explaining reasons in early nodes to denotes time in the later nodes. To further analyze this transition, we create a trajectory between the two end nodes of the path. In particular, we notice that from the sentence, "Since I wanted a better one," to "I have since traded my old car," the meaning of since shifts from causal to temporal. The corresponding attachment positions also transition from a mixed mapper node to one with purely temporal labels, supporting the path evolution hypothesis. Thanks for listening. Please refer to our paper for more details.
All right, so this gives hopefully a sense of the system I'm talking about. But I want to spend a little bit time talking about the examples you just saw, right? So the last example, which is a case study, is looking at the sense in temporal and causal context. It's going pretty fast, so I want to emphasize what's happening. So in this case, we're looking at the token sense in the contextualized embedding. And at the layer 1 of the model, it's actually the word sense actually has 3 ground truth label, either explanation, start time, or time. The color, those are supposed to be 2 different colors, sorry. And in the middle layer, they actually form a path. And then in the last layer, they actually are well separated. So what we're interested in is in the middle layer, where does, at this stage of the model, how is the model sort of getting confused among those different concepts? So that's what we call the path explainer to give us a summary. So it says, so give me the explanation of going from the starting to the end along this path. So the large language model, the explainer will say, the agent will say, well, initially, sense is used in temporal contexts, indicating action events after point in time. Over clusters, usage shift to causal and conditional meaning, often linking actions to justifications, and and evolve from exploratory to assertive and critical. So if you look at the examples, those are sentence examples from the starting location, and those are sentence examples at the end location, right? So this is sort of what the agent can do. The path explainer is going to tell you how does my underlying space is evolving. And further, the trajectory explanation is that, if I start with a starting location and end location, and ask them to give me a bunch of, in this case, one sequence of one token perturbations. And then the idea is, in this one token perturbation, by examining what are the sentences in between, how do I transition from one part of my space to another, right? So that gives you some idea of possible ways those embedding are different from each other. And then, yeah, so there are, of course, some considerations. I'm happy to talk more. There's obviously, we need to deal with hallucinations coming from the underlying large language model for those agents. And then we have to deal with the limitations on the perturbation methods. But I want to give a little bit of time for discussion questions. So that's the end of my talk.